My Aunt Eleanor raised her champagne glass. To Victoria, she announced across the Manhattan Horticultural Gala, the new owner of the Hudson Valley estate. And Evelyn gets nothing. The room erupted in polite applause. I didn't flinch. I just took a calm sip of my water and checked my phone. The digital authorization was ready. 8 minutes later, the estate realtor burst through the banquet doors, utterly panicked. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I had spent my entire life functioning as the unpaid caretaker of my family's legacy. After my parents passed away when I was 7, my Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Richard took me in. They framed it as a supreme act of charity. I was quickly taught that love was a strict transaction and my account was always overdrawn, while Victoria, their biological daughter, was handed every unearned privilege, every private tutor, and every luxury vehicle. I was relegated to the estate's historic greenhouse. My role was brutally simple: unpaid manual laborer. I cultivated their rare plants, managed the soil chemistry, and maintained the sprawling grounds that provided them with their elite social standing. Over the years, the cruelty became normalized. It was a calculated, efficient system. They conditioned me to accept their mistreatment as standard operating procedure. This is the insidious trap of cruel normalization, a dynamic I analyzed using psychological frameworks similar to those outlined in File 1 Pan Tikton G Tikikbangok PDF. When you are exposed to systematic belittlement every single day, your baseline for basic human respect warps entirely. You stop expecting to be treated as an equal and start accepting your role as a silent utility. They didn't hit me. They simply made me invisible, unless they required my labor. It was a highly profitable business model for them. I had survived by putting my head down and focusing solely on the botany. That is the invisible chain of the survivor. You learn to quietly endure the unacceptable, because endurance feels like the only viable survival strategy. You build a psychological prison out of your own resilience, convincing yourself that staying quiet is a sign of strength. In reality, it is a heavy tether keeping you tied to your abusers. My strength had become their greatest financial asset. But endurance has a firm expiration date, and mine was reached at the gala. Before the toasts even began, Uncle Richard had cornered me near the coat check. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and hidden desperation. He shoved a digital contract into my hands. It was a purchase agreement for a highly specialized, 6-figure botanical specimen tree. He demanded I absorb the massive cost through my independent greenhouse business to secretly cover his recent catastrophic gambling debts. He framed it as a mandatory family tax. He told me I owed them for the roof over my head all those years. If I didn't sign the digital authorization invoice on the spot, he threatened to have my independent greenhouse operations permanently blacklisted by the Regional Horticultural Society. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I looked at the exact numbers on the illuminated screen. $150,000. It was pure financial extortion wrapped in family obligation. For 22 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill with my labor, my sweat, and my dignity. Now, he wanted to completely bankrupt my independent livelihood. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret or familial loyalty, but there was only absolute freezing clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I was done being their subsidiary. I opened the invoice on my phone, preparing to execute a decisive transaction that would permanently sever our ties. I held my phone in my hand, staring at the digital authorization invoice that Uncle Richard had demanded I sign. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a trace of panic or despair. I simply typed my name, tapped confirm, and finalized the transaction. $150,000 transferred out of my business account. I paid his extortion fee, effectively purchasing my total freedom from their emotional blackmail. As the confirmation screen illuminated my face, a sudden hush fell over the banquet hall. The low murmur of the Manhattan elite died instantly. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased. I looked up. The grand matriarch of our family, Margaret, had emerged from the shadows near the back of the room. She was the brilliant, self-made founder of our generational commercial landscaping and orchard empire. At 82 years old, she rarely attended these public events, preferring the quiet of the Hudson Valley estate. Yet, there she stood, her posture straight, her presence commanding absolute authority. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as she walked slowly toward the center stage. Aunt Eleanor's triumphant smile vanished. Uncle Richard took a nervous step backward, his face draining of color. Victoria looked bewildered, clutching her champagne glass tightly. Julian, my spineless brother-in-law, physically shrank behind his wife. Margaret did not need a microphone. Her voice cut through the silence with clinical precision. "I have spent decades building an empire from the soil up," she began, her gaze sweeping across her children. "I built it on hard work, strategic foresight, and unwavering dedication. I did not build it to watch it be squandered by parasites." The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "Eleanor, Richard, Victoria, you have spent your entire lives consuming resources you never earned. You have mistaken my quiet observation for approval. You have weaponized our family name for your own vanity and your own debts." She turned her sharp eyes directly onto Uncle Richard. "Your gambling debts are your own, Richard. Extorting the only hard-working member of this family will not save you." Then she looked at the entire assembly of guests. "Effective immediately, the Hudson Valley estate and all associated assets are no longer under the control of my children. There is no transfer of property to Victoria. I have executed an ironclad family trust. This legal structure completely protects the estate from being liquidated or mismanaged by unearned arrogance." My aunt let out a strangled gasp. "Mother, you cannot do this," she pleaded, her voice shrill with sudden panic. "We are your family." Margaret's expression remained entirely impassive. She looked at her daughter with the cold, calculating assessment of an auditor identifying a bad investment. "Family is a partnership built on mutual respect and shared labor," Margaret stated firmly. "What you have demonstrated is systemic exploitation. The new trust is impenetrable. It is signed, sealed, and legally binding as of 1 hour ago." The power dynamic in the room flipped instantaneously. My family wasn't shocked by their own abhorrent behavior. They were shocked that their primary benefactor had finally stopped playing along and completely severed their financial supply line. The next morning, the air in the Hudson Valley estate office was thick with the scent of old paper and polished mahogany. I sat across the heavy oak desk from Margaret. The events of the previous night had completely dismantled my family's financial security, but I felt no sympathy, only a relentless drive to understand the accounting of my own life. Margaret looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the gala having faded to reveal a stark frailty. She slid a thick, leather-bound dossier across the desk toward me. "I have pancreatic cancer," she stated, her voice devoid of any self-pity. "The oncologists have given me exactly 4 months, maybe 5. The revelation did not shatter me. Instead, it snapped everything into sharp, logical focus. Her public intervention wasn't a sudden burst of morality. It was the execution of a finalized exit strategy. This brings us to the silent regret of the watcher. For 22 years, Margaret had observed my exploitation from a distance. She had watched my aunt and uncle systematically reduce me to an unpaid utility. She stayed silent, hoping her children would eventually demonstrate basic human decency. That silence was her greatest regret. When you watch abuse without intervening, you become a silent shareholder in the cruelty, The cancer diagnosis was simply the ultimate deadline that forced her to audit her legacy and violently correct the deficit she had allowed to accrue. I needed to ensure the estate survived, she continued, tapping the dossier. But there is something else you need to know about the transaction you authorized last night. She opened the folder, revealing a series of aged agricultural patents and certified botanical certificates. The 6-figure specimen tree Richard forced you to purchase to cover his debts. It wasn't just a random rare plant. She pushed a specific document toward me. It is a specialized graft from a rare heirloom apple strain. A strain that was originally cultivated and patented by your late biological father. The information processed in my mind with cold, lethal precision. My uncle hadn't just forced me to absorb a random business expense to save his social standing. He had knowingly forced me to buy back a piece of my own stolen heritage to pay for his gambling addiction. It was a targeted psychological desecration. He had weaponized my dead father's legacy to cover his own pathetic financial failures. Richard knew exactly what that specimen was, Margaret said quietly. He brokered the sale specifically to humiliate you while extracting your capital. He thought it was the perfect crime. I stared at the patent documents, my father's signature stark against the yellowed paper. My breathing remained perfectly steady. The anger I felt was absolute zero. It was crystalline and razor sharp. They had crossed the line from casual exploitation to deliberate, calculated theft of my identity. They will lose everything, I stated softly, looking up at Margaret. It wasn't a question. It was a legally binding promise. Yes, she agreed, closing the folder. The eviction notices have already been drafted. The accounting is finally balanced. I gathered the documents, my mind already working through the logistical steps of their complete and total ruin. By Tuesday morning, the news of the Hudson Valley estate trust reallocation had completely leaked to the regional agricultural and business press. The headline read like a corporate obituary. The financial lifeblood of my aunt, uncle, and sister had been clinically and permanently severed. Desperate to salvage her evaporating public reputation and secure future investors for her own failed ventures, Victoria made a catastrophic tactical error. She arranged an emergency call-in interview on the most prominent agricultural business podcast on the East Coast. She intended to spin the narrative, painting herself as the innocent victim of a hostile corporate takeover by an unstable grandmother and a highly manipulative sister. I sat in my greenhouse, meticulously pruning a rare variegated philodendron, listening to the live broadcast on my laptop. Victoria's voice was shrill, laced with poorly manufactured panic. She recited rehearsed talking points about family loyalty and unearned betrayal. But the podcast host, a seasoned investigative financial journalist, had done his rigorous research. He relentlessly pressed her on the sudden transfer of the estate and the growing rumors of severe financial mismanagement. He directly asked about my decades of unpaid labor at the greenhouse. He specifically asked about the 6-figure botanical specimen tree transaction. Under the intense public pressure, Victoria's polished facade completely fractured. The host cornered her on the basic ethics of my unpaid servitude. "We gave her a roof over her head," Victoria snapped, her voice escalating into a hysterical scream, broadcast live to tens of thousands of industry listeners. "She was nothing before us. We earned that estate by putting up with her. We deserved every single penny of that trust, and we deserved to use her labor to maintain our elite standard of living." It was an immediate, unmitigated public relations disaster. She had just confessed, on a recorded and widely distributed digital platform, to systematic financial and emotional exploitation. She didn't just dig her own grave. She paved it in concrete. Simultaneously, my legal counsel was executing the next phase of the strategy. While Victoria was actively melting down on the podcast, my attorneys were filing emergency injunctions in the state Supreme Court. We moved to permanently freeze all of Richard, Eleanor, and Victoria's personal banking assets and investment portfolios. The forensic accounting team Margaret had discreetly hired conducted a rapid, ruthless audit of the family's historical finances. The results were absolutely devastating. The audit uncovered years of systematic, calculated embezzlement. Richard and Eleanor hadn't just been living lavishly. They had been actively siphoning significant capital from various minor trust funds established for the estate's agricultural workers and local community development grants. The evidence was entirely irrefutable. Fraudulent bank transfers, forged authorization signatures, and offshore dummy corporations. The civil dispute over the estate had instantly metastasized into a massive criminal fraud investigation. I didn't smile as the podcast host abruptly ended the interview with a stunned, uncomfortable silence. I didn't feel victorious. I simply felt the cold, analytical satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. They weren't just losing their high social standing. They were actively facing imminent federal indictments. I closed my laptop, the greenhouse silent except for the mechanical hum of the climate control system. The retaliation was methodical, precise, and absolute. The legal checkmate was complete, and they had willingly provided the final piece of incriminating evidence themselves. The transaction was over. At exactly 11:45 in the morning the following day, a rented, mid-range sedan pulled up the gravel driveway of my independent greenhouse. It was a stark downgrade from the fleet of luxury vehicles my family usually commanded. Stripped of their frozen assets, their social standing, and their public dignity, Uncle Richard and Aunt Eleanor emerged from the vehicle. They looked physically diminished. The arrogant posture they had carried for decades had collapsed under the weight of imminent bankruptcy and federal fraud charges. They arrived entirely unannounced, desperately seeking an audience with the utility they had abused for 22 years. I stood quietly among my thriving rows of rare orchids and heirloom saplings. I didn't stop working. I carefully recorded the soil chemistry levels on my clipboard as they approached the open glass doors. Eleanor's face was blotchy, her expensive makeup ruined by genuine panic. Richard's hands trembled slightly at his sides. They had come to beg. "Evelyn, please," Eleanor pleaded, her voice cracking as she stepped into the humid air of the greenhouse. "You have to talk to Margaret. You have to intervene. The lawyers have frozen everything. We can't even access the accounts to hire defense attorneys. We are going to lose the house." I looked at them, feeling absolutely nothing. This perfectly illustrates the illusion of power in an empty wallet. For their entire lives, Richard and Eleanor believed their superiority was an inherent character trait. They confused the power of their bank accounts with the value of their actual identities. They believed their high social status was undeniable proof of their superiority. But prestige is merely a subscription service, and they had just defaulted on their payments. When the money vanished, the illusion evaporated, revealing them as empty, terrified individuals with no internal moral compass or actual leverage. They didn't possess power. They had only rented it. Now, facing complete ruin, they had absolutely no inner strength to rely on. "We are family," Richard added, his voice lacking any of its usual booming authority. "You owe us for taking you in. You have to make her stop this. Tell her we'll compromise." I set my clipboard down on the stainless steel potting table with a decisive click. I didn't yell. I didn't recount the years of unpaid labor or the psychological extortion. This wasn't a negotiation, and it certainly wasn't an emotional reconciliation. It was a final delivery of paperwork. I reached into the pocket of my work apron and retrieved a folded legal document. I walked over and handed it directly to Richard. He unfolded it with shaking fingers. It was a finalized, court-ordered eviction notice from the historic Hudson Valley estate. It mandated their complete removal from the premises within 48 hours. Richard stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Eleanor let out a sharp, devastated sob, finally understanding the absolute finality of their situation. "You need to intervene," Richard whispered, staring blindly at the eviction mandate. I already did, I said quietly. My voice was cold, flat, and entirely unyielding. I turned my back on them and firmly pulled the heavy glass door of the greenhouse shut, the latch engaging with a heavy, metallic finality. I locked it, leaving them standing outside in the dirt. 4 months later, the crisp autumn frost had just begun to settle over the sprawling, meticulously restored orchards of the Hudson Valley estate. Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, exactly as the leading oncologists had predicted. She left this world having perfectly balanced her final ledger, ensuring that the massive legacy she built would be completely protected from the parasites who had tried to ruthlessly consume it. I stood in the center of the grand estate office, no longer an unpaid laborer or a convenient utility, but the sole legal custodian of the entire agricultural empire. The financial transition was seamless, methodical, and legally impenetrable. My very first executive action was not an act of ongoing vengeance, but a calculated investment in the future. I immediately established the Margaret and Heritage Foundation, heavily funding it with the millions in recovered assets that Richard and Eleanor had systematically embezzled over the years. The foundation was designed with a singular, strict mandate to provide aggressive financial grants, fully funded scholarships, and robust legal protection for young, independent botanists and agricultural workers. I ensured that no one else would ever be forced to trade their human dignity or their exhaustive labor for a simple roof over their head. The historic estate was now actively thriving, its rare heirloom apple strains meticulously cataloged, cultivated, and permanently protected. As I walked through the quiet, thriving greenhouse that morning, I finally allowed myself to reflect deeply on the cold mechanics of my survival and retaliation. For anyone watching who has ever felt violently relegated to the spares table, this is my sincere letter to those who always feel pushed to the margins. I spent decades of my life genuinely believing that if I just worked harder, stayed quieter, and endured more abuse, I would eventually earn my rightful place in their family structure. But I've come to realize that toxic family systems are not broken. They are functioning exactly as they were designed to function. The people who directly benefit from your silent subjugation will never voluntarily hand you the key to your own cage. You absolutely do not need to earn your fundamental worth from the exact people who are actively profiting from your pain. Severing those toxic ties isn't an act of unwarranted cruelty. It is an act of supreme, necessary self-preservation. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. And sometimes forgiveness simply means permanently closing the door, locking it, and walking away without ever looking back. I had spent 22 years operating as a silent subsidiary in a totally bankrupt emotional enterprise. Now, I was the sole proprietor of my own peaceful life. I didn't seek chaotic revenge. I executed clinical justice. I reclaimed the soil, I protected the harvest, and I permanently eradicated the rot that had infected the roots for generations. The orchard was finally mine, and the silence was incredibly beautiful. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, hit the subscribe button, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.